Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. As always, we've got another great episode for you, but I want to give you a reminder. There is the wonderful opportunity to boost your IQ and possibly even your height if you sign up for Highly Respected's IQ supplements at highlyrespected.substack.com. I've been showing you guys off all the testimonials of people just saying how they've changed their lives. Like, women are looking at them better. Even look at our guest last week, Nightmare Vision. He signed up for it. Before he was a struggling owl. He was having problems. The other female owls weren't looking at him. They thought he was an idiot. But then he signed up for IQ supplements. Life changer. So I just want to give you guys that reminder before we go into the episode. So the first topic I, of course, want to talk about is we've got a new federal holiday over the weekend. I assume everyone celebrated Juneteenth. I mean, it's a long family tradition for many of our listeners. Several people tell me that they've, even as kids, they hoped that one day Juneteenth would become a federal holiday. So obviously, without even really any prior notice, like the Senate unanimously consented to make Juneteenth a federal holiday last week. I wasn't even seeing any news reports about how they're going to make Juneteenth a holiday. I always assumed they were going to do this because Biden was committed to it. Trump was even committed to it. Everyone in Congress seemed committed to it. There wasn't any pushback against it. The only pushback in 2020 against it was, oh, well, that may waste the government more money and work hours if we give government workers another holiday. That was really the only opposition we're seeing to this. So I always assumed that we're going to get Juneteenth, but we hadn't heard about it for months, and nobody seemed to be caring about it. They thought it would go by without having a federal holiday, but sure enough, just a few days before, I believe on Tuesday, Senate unanimously consented. Senate's at House. The House, only 14 Republicans opposed it, and then they passed it on Wednesday, and on Thursday, Biden signed it into law, giving government workers the whole day off on Friday. So we're glad that the government workers got their day off, just in time, thanks to President Biden. So there was an awkward response from Republicans and conservatives to this holiday. It was very abrupt, and of course, no Republican senator opposed it. And then there were a few, as I said before, there were 14 Republicans who opposed it in the House. Matt Rosendale, who's a representative from Montana, had a very good response. He's saying, this is enshrining identity politics in our system. This is going to replace July 4th. This is essentially critical race theory, the holiday. That's totally true. I've been saying that as well. This is critical race theory, the holiday. Is that Republicans and conservatives want to say that they oppose critical race theory, that it's imposing this anti-American vision. It teaches hatred for this nation, hatred for a group of people, hatred for whites. All of that is taught by Juneteenth and enshrining that as one of our federal holidays. And all these people are complaining about CRT as a threat to our country, the threat to our national identity and how we view ourselves. Simply, we're like, oh yeah, we'll have Juneteenth. It'll be great. We're just simply celebrating American values and American liberty, American freedom on this holiday. That's absolutely not true, even though Republicans kept saying this. Kay Cole James, the president of Heritage Foundation, the affirmative action president of Heritage Foundation, wrote this whole column about how it's not a woke holiday, it's a American holiday. It's about how we're a best country on earth because we're an idea and everyone can share in this idea of liberty and equality. And all these Republicans who kept celebrating it, the funniest thing is they would all use the Juneteenth hashtag. And the Juneteenth hashtag was a black power fist with rainbow-colored knuckles and fingers. And it's like, this is not, and one of her tweets is like, it's not a woke holiday. Juneteenth is not a woke holiday. And right next to it is a rainbow-colored black power fist. And you're like, your message is undermined by the very fist, the emoji that comes along with the hashtag. Several prominent leaders were including the Juneteenth hashtag. Senator John Cornyn, who was one of the lead sponsors of the bill, Elise Stefanik, Mike Pence, Tim Scott, a few others, and they kept doing this. And it's so embarrassing to see them with this hashtag, and they're like, this is a holiday for freedom and all these goofy conservative concepts we've created. And the hashtag totally undermines that. But conservatives, except for Matt Rosen, I think Rosendale had a perfect response to this, and there was a way that it's able to translate into the mainstream. It's simply just saying this is like enshrining critical race theory as a reigning ideology. This is not good. This is not about celebrating emancipation. This is about making America feel bad for slavery, about making white people feel bad for slavery, about demonizing them, and it's about calling for reparations and ending quote unquote systemic racism. This is what the holiday's about. Why are you idiots making another unnecessary holiday? We've already have enough holidays celebrating blacks. They already have their own History Month. They've got Martin Luther King Day. We even have Kwanzaa. We have all these holidays set aside to stroking black narcissism, and you want to create another holiday for them. And then the other point is that this, even though 1619 Project's included in what conservatives see as the big picture of critical race theory, I've said this before. This is a part of 1619 Project. Goal is to say, blacks are put at the central focus of American history. They are the true founders. Whites are the villains. And this is Juneteenth further reinforces that notion. I mean, because, even though it's a white Union general with a white Union army telling the slaves they're free in Texas in June 19th, 1865, that's no longer the accepted narrative. The accepted narrative is blacks somehow freed themselves during the Civil War, which not true at all. They were only a minuscule fraction of the Union Army. Although I think they're less than 10% of all war casualties. It may even be less than 5%. They were not the centerpiece of the Union Army. Whites freed them. Whites issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Whites signed the 13th Amendment, and pretty much out of the 700,000 Americans who died in the Civil War, nearly all of them were white. So this was a war conducted primarily between whites, and whites freed them. But we can't acknowledge whites did anything good. And the other thing is that whites created the ideology. I don't know. Ideology is probably not the best way to say that, but the whites created the idea that we should not have slavery. I mean, throughout Africa, they kept practicing slavery. Like, abolitionism didn't come from West Africa. It wasn't arising from the blacks themselves. It came from whites, and this was a movement throughout the 19th century that would have not happened if it wasn't for whites. It wasn't just blacks deciding one day, oh, we freed themselves. And that's why they're also, upholding these murderous, horrible figures like Nat Turner, who did not free slaves at all. All he did was slaughter a couple dozen whites, primarily women and children, and that actually helped reinforce slavery. But regardless, they're going to claim that Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth did all the heavy lifting of freeing the slaves, and whites just simply didn't do anything. It totally eliminates whites from the story. Well, it doesn't eliminate them. It places them only in the role of villain, and the protagonist is blacks, and blacks freed themselves. Jamel Bowie wrote a column last year in the New York Times arguing this point, went viral, everyone agreed with it, and that point cannot be argued against. And even if conservatives are arguing against it, they're going to lose because oh, you're a racist. You're saying we didn't free ourselves? We definitely freed ourselves. We're magic Americans. We're able to do that. We have that ability and power to do that. So this is not a holiday for all Americans. It's simply one for magic Americans. And there were several tweets, many of them went viral, of blacks who are complaining that whites get the holiday off for a black holiday. And this is going to become more of a problem as the years go on, because anti-white racism and the feeling that whites shouldn't have any any privileges or any good things to happen to them, especially when it's something that's supposed to focus solely on one particular racial or ethnic group. This argument's going to carry more weight, and you could see this at a point where they're saying, okay, we're going to give the day off, but only blacks can have the day off. Whites have to work. Now, anti-discrimination law, I don't think that may not allow that, of course, but they can make these changes where there's certain exceptions for minority groups, and blacks are going to argue for this too. They're not going to like the fact that whites are turning this into the new July 4th, where they all have a cookout and setting off fireworks. they don't like that where the whites can have a nice family holiday around this. It can only be for blacks to have that nice family holiday. One of the dismissive criticisms from respectable conservatives who like Juneteenth is that there's no way on earth that this would replace July 4th or would supersede July 4th. Jonah Goldberg wrote this horrible column for the Dispatch calling it American Passover, and is like, this is a great holiday. And it's like, no, you idiots, it's not going to replace July 4th. We're going to celebrate both, even though they're only 2 weeks apart. And for many cities and localities, they have to determine which they're going to place resources on, July 4th or Juneteenth. And there's already examples of cities and towns that have canceled July 4th festivities so they could have those, festivities for Juneteenth. There are limited resources for these cities and towns. And if they're told like, oh, you can't do Juneteenth, but you can do July 4th, that's racist. So a lot of these places are, if they can't afford both, they're going to go with Juneteenth. And that's already going to create the impression that Juneteenth is a more important holiday. It also comes first. It also has a racial aspect, which that racial aspect has to be respected. And as I always like to repeat, is that blacks are at the center of American life right now. They're semi-divine figures, magic Americans, you may call them, who have to be worshipped and have to get all these special privileges, especially at the expense of whites. And Juneteenth, unlike July 4th, isn't a problematic holiday. July 4th celebrates dead white men and how they fought for, declared independence to oppress Indians and slaves, while Juneteenth is celebrating blacks freeing themselves, even though it's actually celebrating an order delivered by a white Union general at the head of a white Union army to slaves. But we'll not let historical accuracy get in the way of a myth. It is very stupid for people like Jonah Goldberg to say this will never happen. It's always like, there's no such thing as a slippery slope. The slippery slope has been continually posting W's for the last 50 or 60 years. Like, they're like, oh, this won't happen. That absolutely happens. If you look at all the people who are saying, oh, nothing bad will emerge from gay marriage becoming legalized. Like, we're not going to have drag queen story hour in preschools. That will never happen. We're not going to end women's sports because some transgender athlete wants to be in there. That'll never happen. That's being ridiculous. Like, the slippery slope has continually won out time and time again. Now you may say, like, July 4th is such an important holiday for people, and there are millions and millions of Americans who have grown up with that as like one of the most important holidays in the calendar. People have long memories of it, going to the lake or going out with their family and seeing the fireworks. It is a strongly developed holiday in our national consciousness. That could easily be replaced by Juneteenth, is that all those festivities now becomes associated with Juneteenth, and instead of red, white, and blue fireworks, we get black power fireworks. The black, green, and our green and red, or whatever the colors they have for black power. Those become what we see instead of red, white, and blue. And now that's the holiday. That's the big summer holiday that replaces July 4th. And yeah, July 4th is still going to have its importance. It may just become the white Juneteenth, which would actually be a positive development. Is that, we're so balkanized that blacks get their own summer holiday, that's Juneteenth, and then whites get their other summer holiday. But when it becomes a matter of conflict between public services of like who is going to receive priority, it's obviously going to be Juneteenth. As we've seen with the cities and localities that have already decided to, nix their July 4th festivities because they're already putting in resources for Juneteenth. And, so it's already happening. It's already going to have the matter of superseding it. And we're continually going to tout this as a more important holiday because, as the 1619 Project says, our true founding is in 1776. It's 1619 when black people arrived. Blacks are the center part of our history. Whites are just only the villains. And Juneteenth serves that much more effectively than July 4th, where July 4th, it's all about white people. White people were at the Constitutional Convention, or Continental Congress, and they were the ones who signed the Declaration of Independence. They were the ones who calling for independence from Great Britain. There's not an important black founding father who signed the Declaration of Independence, no matter how much they want to insert him in there. This process of superseding July 4th is going to take a long time. It's not going to happen next year or probably even the year after that. But you could see this by 2030, where the celebrations around Juneteenth dwarf July 4th, because Juneteenth makes much more sense to the current American nation than July 4th and it makes much more sense to the historical narrative and the mythos they want to build around the globalist American empire than July 4th. And there is a point to this, that the only reason we have a Juneteenth holiday, so a lot of people pointing this out, is that Trump had decided to have a rally in Tulsa. Once again, another problematic thing, that he would have his first big rally in Tulsa, because Tulsa is where the worst race massacre in human history ever occurred. That's official history now, according to President Biden. But he decided to have it on Juneteenth, less than a month after George Floyd's death. This was considered an outrage, and everyone was mad about it. And they began insisting that Juneteenth is a real holiday. And due to Trump having that rally, or planning that rally for Juneteenth, may have led to this in order to own Trump and to troll him. And that's what set the ball rolling. It's just these weird historical events. And it was George Floyd's death that also contributed as well, is that we had this huge outpouring of rage and riots and all white people going crazy and bending the knee for blacks, that there needed to be, an official commemoration for this new movement within our society, this new feeling within our society, and Juneteenth serves that purpose. So that's why we have this 100% authentic holiday that all Americans are familiar with. But that's now our history. And so there's another point to go on with how conservatives respond to this historical fight that's now brewing within our societies. This goes along with their critical race theory fight, is that what's the alternative that conservatives are proposing to Juneteenth, to critical race theory, to this new feeling, or this new centralization around blacks, even though conservatives are embracing that as well. What is their alternative? And there was an interesting essay that was published in Harper's last week by the historian Matthew Karp. Matthew Karp he's at Princeton. He's an American historian. He's, of course, a leftist. He's appeared on Chapo Trap House and a couple of podcasts like that, but he's a very good historian. He wrote this great book called This Vast Southern Empire. Very good book about antebellum America and how the South was intertwined with the national culture, and they were really the drivers of American expansionism. It's a very good book. I'll probably have an IQ supplement on it sometime. I'm not going to say sometime soon, but I probably will reread it. It's an easy read. But that digression, he wrote a good essay on the fight over history and American politics and American society. And it served as one of the central pieces is, there's not really much opposition towards tearing down these Confederate monuments. I mean, last summer they just wiped out, these, Monument Row in Richmond, which was one of the selling points of, to visit Richmond is like you're going there to see Monument Row. Well, they took all that down because of racism. We can't honor the Confederacy anymore. And several other places, they tore up and unearthed even Confederate figures to get them out of the public sphere. As we're seeing in Memphis, they dug up Nathan Bedford Forrest and are throwing him out somewhere. Well, they're taking him to the Sons of Confederate Veterans are putting him in a Sons of Confederate Veterans facility. I guess facility would be the right word, but a field that they own. So I guess that will be a much better resting place than downtown Memphis for any person. But in this history, as Karp was saying, that the left is turning to 1619 historiography that places the origins of America in 1619, says slavery is the original sin, and it really is this negative feeling about America, that America cannot escape what it did in the colonial era, it cannot escape colonialism, it cannot escape slavery, it cannot escape Indian warfare, it cannot escape segregation, all these negative attributes that the left upholds with 1619 and critical race theory. That is the history, and it's almost this, they can't, America cannot overcome it, but it can only atone for it and work for it. And eventually, and even though Karp doesn't necessarily argue this, say this in his article, obviously because it'd be a little bit too based, but it is like that type of historiography is all about making whites inferior to non-whites and non-whites serve as the central focus of American history. He makes a very good point about what conservatives are arguing, is that they're arguing for pretty much no real historical theory, is that all it is accepting the premise of the old liberal historiography. In many ways, they are the last guardians of liberal historiography. But all they do is they reimagine every conflict as an eternal battle between Republicans and Democrats. As conservatives will say race is not real, but party affiliation is 100% real. And that's the only ethnicity that matters. The way conservatives imagine Republicans and Democrats in this historical fight is in a lot of ways like how these 19th century racial writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain imagine this eternal battle between Aryans and Semites. There was like, oh, it's the Aryan Rome versus Semitic Carthage. And they always wrote this, and a lot of 19th century writers were into this kind of not necessarily accurate and a little goofy way of looking at history. But with conservatives, that's exactly right. But instead of Aryan versus Semitic or any other type of way of viewing this is Republican versus Democrat. So it's like Republican Greece versus Democrat Persia, Republican Rome versus Democrat Carthage, Republican Europe versus Democrat Turks. It's like this eternal battle where it's like, did you know the Turks who were raping and enslaving Europeans were Democrats? That's how they view this history, is that there's like this this eternal battle that like some beginning of history there was Cain was the first Democrat. When they imagine that as like our history. And that's all they can argue is like, oh, it looks like they're taking down Democrat statues. And it's the same with Juneteenth, is they're arguing, oh, Democrats don't want to know this. This is the day Republicans took away their slaves. Oh, we got those Democrats. Breitbart wrote a whole article. It was really one of the worst articles, even worse probably than Jonah Goldberg's article about Juneteenth. It is like all like, we're commemorating the day Republicans took away Democrat slaves, and it's like, really, come on now. Like this conservative ethnography boils down to that. Even though they're not always been like fans of Republicans. I mean, it's like, do you really like every Republican? It's like, but that's like their ethnic group. It's Republican versus Democrats. And Democrats, of course, don't acknowledge this because it's like completely silly. It's stupid. But that's how they imagine history. And Karp points it out as that it's essentially just trolling. It's PragerU trolling, but it ultimately accepts all the premises that's offered by liberal historiography. It's like, yes, slavery is, well, obviously slavery is bad, but yes, we've had all these great sins, but we've worked harder, and this America is just an idea. And we're really, what makes us great and unique and exceptional is these ideas. And Jonah Goldberg writes in his article is that, he's a hardcore supporter of cringe American exceptionalism, in the way that not necessarily thinking that he got mad that Barack Obama, this is also how like stuck in the past all these conservative pundits are. They're still mad about these random things that Obama said because they wasted so much effort and time on like complaining about perfectly defensible Obama statements that they still bring them up today. And he brought up some Obama statement, I believe it's from 2009, who said, Obama's like, I believe in American exceptionalism in the same way British believe in British exceptionalism, French believe in French exceptionalism. And I actually agree. I actually think that's actually a very poignant point, is that saying like, we as Americans think that we're an exceptional nation because we're Americans. And the same way the Germans and French and Indonesians or whoever believing the same about their nation. And I think that's actually a pretty right-wing take. Jonah Goldberg doesn't like that, and he was very mad, upset, and he's like, Trump continued this on. I hated that statement. But he really thinks that Biden is upholding American exceptionalism because he's saying that we're the only nation built on an idea. We were not built on, unlike other nations, we have no ethnicity that's tied to it. Fact check, false. And that's what makes us an exceptional nation, is that we're dedicated to liberty and freedom. We're built on an idea. No other country is like this, and Russia is just can't understand that because they're not built on an idea, even though they spent most of the 20th century living under a government that was also built on just an idea, the Soviet Union. Apparently the Soviet Union was not an idea, but America is. Go figure. But the Soviet Union is much more of an idea than the United States of America. But, we're not going to get into, I guess that's something that they never consider. But with that idea, that is very, that actually contributes more to liberal thinking and liberal historiography than anything else. And Karp just says that, there isn't any necessarily point to it, and there's no real defense of the Confederate statues. The only real defense offered in the public, this includes Tucker, is that this will lead to the destruction of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and figures that all Americans would have celebrated up until 10 years ago, 5 or 10 years ago. And that's the only reason to oppose Confederate monuments, is that but like even 20 years ago, George W. Bush, when he was running for president in 2000, he defended, Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag, and saying like, this is our heritage and we've got to stand up for this. And conservatives would say that like they fought a good fight, or Robert E. Lee was the perfect gentleman and that he's American hero, and Dwight Eisenhower and all these figures had always seen Robert E. Lee as one of the greatest Americans in our history. Conservatives no longer put forth those arguments. It's simply, well, we're trying to defend Lincoln and Jefferson and Washington. And, one of the great, embodiments or representations of conservative historiography is the horrible 1776 commission report that the Trump administration issued in his final days of office, which repeated liberal historiography, so saying America's an idea. White, evil Southern Democrats invented identity politics, and we're just not connected to any ethnicity or culture or race. We're just about an idea, and that's what makes America great. And the penultimate American is, of course, Martin Luther King. That's what we're about. That's what we need to counter critical race theory with. And in this article with Karp, he eventually argues for a more nuanced, more leftist version of what 90s liberal triumphant historiography would have been about for America, where it's like, we had all these bad things, but we've overcome them. Look at all the good things we've had. We're now toppling Confederate monuments. That's a part of our history too, and that's a part of America now. I would argue that's not necessarily America, that's the globalist American empire, but there is a point with that, and conservatives would probably gravitate towards that. But I think the main important point for the article is just saying that conservatives don't really have a historical alternative to critical race theory. It's either return to the 90s of standard liberal historiography, or it's just troll them with the eternal battle between Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans are always the good guys and Democrats are always the bad guys, and every story is played out like this, and that's the extent of it. There's no clear-cut defense argued for the historic American nation. There's no point saying that like, we're not an idea, we're a people, we're a nation, and we have certain interests and we must defend our heritage. That's never pointed out, and it's never. And they always share the same icons that liberals have, like Martin Luther King and others of that sort. And there's no need for that. And even he points out is like the 1776 report is like filled with paeans to Frederick Douglass and others. So this is not what we need. And I think that this is going to become a further problem with conservatives. And this is why they lose on Juneteenth, is that there's no serious articulation, no well thought out alternative to what the left is pushing, and that's why they're able to win and become gain these radical victories, such as making another new national holiday out of whole cloth, and I'm able to implement anti-white, anti-American history in classrooms across the nation. And even though I say it's always a white pill about how ordinary parents are rising up against critical race theory in the classroom, there does come a limit into their ability to fight back against that, because there's no alternative proposed. I mean, 1776 is report is the alternative, and that's just returning to the 90s. That's not a real alternative. There needs to be a serious alternative that defends our nation, that defends our heritage, that teaches that we are not an idea, we are an actual people, and that comes with a certain level of understanding that does not lead you to be a cringe like Jonah Goldberg or Joe Biden or any of these idiots who celebrate Juneteenth as this great holiday. So I think over time, Juneteenth will eventually, unless there's serious changes in American society, Juneteenth will supersede July 4th in importance. And what may happen is that they become segregated holidays, is that Juneteenth becomes the black holiday, July 4th becomes the white holiday. That's actually a pretty interesting development. I think that would actually be a much better development than Juneteenth becoming the holiday that all Americans, regardless of color, celebrate, which that's probably the worst development, but I think it'd probably be better if the blacks get so upset by whites celebrating it that they're like, you can't celebrate that. July 4th is your holiday, and then we're like, okay, thanks. We'll accept that agreement. You guys can celebrate Juneteenth. We'll celebrate July 4th. See, well, you can take this weekend off. We'll take a weekend off in 2 weeks. I think that would probably be the best development of that. But, there is a point where there is something, that the old America cannot come back from these public holidays, because this is how we develop a national consciousness. This is how we see ourselves as a people. When we created Martin Luther King holiday, he became the equivalent of the founding fathers. Sam Francis wrote this at the time. He wrote a speech for Jesse Helms saying in the Senate in the 1980s, when Jesse Helms was opposing Martin Luther King holiday, Helms, speaking with Francis's words, was saying that this would elevate him to the level of founding father, which is an outrage. Now he is to that level of the founding father, and only Abraham Lincoln is the only other figure who can rise who is somebody who is not of the the revolutionary time period, who rises to that level. And he's even more important because President's Day is, all of them are just lumped into one holiday. Martin Luther King gets his own holiday, which makes it more important. And there is a certain overcoming where most Americans have a high opinion of Martin Luther King due to the fact that we get a day off for him. And Juneteenth's, purpose and the ideology behind that will take a stronger root in our nation due to the fact that it's a national holiday. So there is a kind of, it's certainly a turning point, USA, you could say, that it is. But I always issue that you shouldn't necessarily be blackpilled, because there's always opportunities for this, and it's ultimately a part of the process of us winning. And it could have the upside of making July 4th our holiday, the holiday to celebrate the historic American people and their achievements and their heritage, while Juneteenth is to celebrate the globalist American empire and its semi-divine beings that they worship. So that's my concluding remarks on Juneteenth. So speaking of developing public consciousness, there was a interesting event that happened on late night TV last week. I mean, most of the things we're talking about are dealing with last week's events, since I now do these podcasts on Monday, so I don't necessarily get to talk about all the cool things that happened the week before. And this event, all conservatives totally soy-jacked over this event. They're like, oh man, this is so cool. On the Stephen Colbert show, Jon Stewart appeared as a guest, and he had the balls to talk about the lab leak theory and how it's true. And people were going, whoa, speaking truth to power. Oh my God, the desk is shaking. I can't believe he's doing this. And I mean, I would say, and he went on a joke, and there was some mild backlash against it, mainly from libtards who still have a long enough memory to remember that CNN and New York Times, Washington Post all told them that this was a conspiracy theory spread by evil right-wing people, and you shouldn't believe it because you got to remember it came from the bats, it came from the wet market. It didn't even come from China, depending on where how deep in the indoctrination they were. So there were some people who are still opposed to that and were still upset. But most people are fine with this, and there was no like censorship of Jon Stewart, and everyone's celebrating him as like a hero, even liberals and others. And generally, liberals are now fine with the lab leak origin. The United States government is investigating this. I mean, the United States government is saying now, under the Biden administration, is saying that this may have been the origin for the coronavirus. And Jake Sullivan went on the Sunday shows, that's the National Security Advisor, to demand that China let them investigate the origins of COVID, and with the implication it may have been a lab leak. So this is officially accepted now. It's not a controversial thing to say that it is. That COVID could potentially been leaked from a Wuhan lab. That's not controversial anymore to say. Even though conservatives were going crazy over it, it reminded me of like Ricky Gervais's like his various awards show speeches where he'd go off about cancel culture, political correctness, and like, liberal Hollywood is never going to let him back. It's very much like that. It's saying we have a designated person who is safe, who can say these things and can change, signal to liberals that it's okay to believe in this now. And that's the purpose that Jon Stewart has. I even saw people who were saying, wow, this is a true return to Jon Stewart speaking truth to power during the Iraq War days. And Jon Stewart, like the Daily Show in the lead up to the Iraq War, was supportive of it. I mean, there's several clips showing the Daily Show segments mocking Iraq War critics and Iraq War opponents and showing Saddam Hussein as a bad guy. It was not on the side of the anti-war opposition. It wasn't necessarily fully war hawkish, but it was not. It was definitely not on the critic side. If Jon Stewart is saying something, you can rest assured that is not a controversial point of view. That is not a threat to the establishment. That's not a threat to the system. That's the system speaking back to you. That is power speaking to truth. It's not ever truth speaking to power. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind with this is, so why is someone like Jon Stewart saying this? Shouldn't Jon Stewart's role, I don't think he necessarily gave too many interviews last year, but in that role last year is, the court jester, which is not necessarily the previous role of the court jester of having the, ability to make fun of people in power and get away with it. The court jester's today role is to make fun of people without power so people in power can laugh. And that is what the role of Jon Stewart is. He would have made fun of the people who were talking about the COVID lab leak, called them idiots, and it's like, trust the experts, trust the scientists. That's what he and Stephen Colbert, that's their role. Stephen Colbert much more so than Jon Stewart. So why is he saying this? Like, why is the media suddenly taking this more seriously? Why is this abrupt face turn on this issue? The evidence, there isn't necessarily more new evidence than what we had last year. Plenty of people had the same access to the information, said that there's something off here, that looks like this may have been a lab leak, but they were denounced and criticized and demonized and called truthers, and this type of information was banned from social media. If you had shared something in a post saying that this is a lab leak, you could have been banned from Twitter or Facebook. I believe Zero Hedge was banned from Twitter in the spring of 2020 for merely sharing an article claiming that it may have been a lab leak. That information was not allowed, but now New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN are publishing articles, wondering if the lab leak theory is true. So why this sudden turn? Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that Trump is no longer around. Saying it was like it was due to a lab leak associated you with Trump, associated with you with the right, that was just passe, and we couldn't. And a lot of the COVID response was just a knee jerk reaction to whatever Trump was doing. People have argued that if Trump had been an early supporter of mask wearing, that liberals would have opposed of wearing masks, and they would have said this mask solved nothing. This is undue paranoia. So if Trump had actually been promoting all the things the liberals were about with COVID, they would have said he's an idiot. I think even in the case if he had been proposing lockdowns in, say, February, we would have probably never had a lockdown, because that would have been supporting whatever Trump was saying. So it is this kind of knee-jerk reaction to Trump. Trump was even suggesting that it was a lab leak. So as one is like associated with Trump and the disrepute that causes. The second is, the one thing is that the system is actually veering towards anti-China. Is that the military-industrial complex, the deep state, is not a fan of China, and they do want to pivot us away from the Middle East to China. That was one of the big foreign policy goals of Obama. He was never able to do that. Biden hopes to do that. That's one of the reasons why we're pulling out of Afghanistan, and we're trying to draw down our presence in the Middle East, because we want to pivot towards Asia, and we want to pivot towards Africa, and to counteract Chinese colonialism there. And this is a part of why the lab leak is suddenly popular, is that the Biden administration, now with Trump gone, now without having to worry that, with calling it the China virus and the Wuhan flu is encouraging anti-Asian resentment and anti-Asian violence, they now feel like they don't have to worry about that. Any anti-Asian violence they can simply blame on Trump. But with China, they no longer have to worry about anti-China being associated with Trump. Trump is no longer in the picture. They can make anti-China feeling their own. And in order to stoke that among the population, the lab leak theory helps that. I mean, if you convince the population that the reason why we had these shutdowns, the reason why we lost over 500,000 people, the reason why our whole life was overturned and completely changed and shut down for over a year was due to the Chinese, that helps their ambitions. That helps encourage defense spending. That encourages more support for Taiwan, more support in other places in Southeast Asia that oppose Chinese expansion, supports efforts in Africa to oppose Chinese colonialism there. So it does help win over the public. I think it is true too. I mean, I think it is largely true that it's a lab leak. But I don't think it's no longer an idea that threatens the system. It actually supports the system and supports the establishment's goals of making the people and trying to unite America around this anti-Chinese sentiment. So we ignore the problems at home. We ignore our corrupt leadership. We ignore the magic Americans performing magic tricks in our cities, and we ignore what's the evil, toxic ideology promoted in our schools, and we forget, we ignore the crisis at the border and everything else that is happening in our country, and we just focus on China as the real threat to our country. And that serves the interests of the globalist American empire. The globalist American empire is actually opposed to China, even though it does benefit, as particularly our corporations and Wall Street benefit from closer ties to China. And every major American corporation wants to end into China. They don't want to upset China. And corporate America doesn't necessarily like this new Cold War footing. And we not necessarily can have a new Cold War footing, because unlike Trump and people who support Trump, they don't want to bring back our manufacturing. They want to leave our manufacturing in China, but they want a weaker China that is in an inferior position to the United States, and they feel that China is getting too big for its shoes, and it must be put back in its proper place. And in order to do that, we need the majority of American population seeing China as a threat, and the lab leak hypothesis reinforces that. And that's why it's now popular. Now it's why it's accepted, is that we are going to, that anti-China sentiment is now appropriate. It's now acceptable. It's now encouraged, because it no longer has the taint of Trumpism, and they figured out how to make it not racist. So that's why Jon Stewart is, getting away with sharing the COVID lab leak hypothesis, the theory, because it doesn't upset the system anymore. The system wants people to believe this. No, that's not more I'm saying that like you should disbelieve it. I think it is true, and I think it is outrageous that China was effectively able to get away with this, but I also understand that this supports the globalist American empire's interest, and we should not be soy jacking over random libtard celebrities, sharing this idea with the public. I think that there's actually something worrisome about that, and you should be like, why are they doing this? And it is to promote the globalist American empire's interest. And the other big point I want to share with this is that this also does show the power of propaganda, the power of media, is that they can convince people overnight to believe the complete opposite of what they were told for an entire year, simply because a celebrity like Jon Stewart tells them to. I mean, most people, the NPC meme was so dead on. It was one of the best memes that we created. It's unfortunate that conservatives ruined it to simply just say, like, it's a standard liberal who's like, oh, I'm repeating, I don't like Brett Kavanaugh, or I don't like Trump, Orange Man bad. Even though those are NPC sentiments, there is this type of person. I mean, I think this is in all societies, but they really dominate discourse and shape our country here. Is that these people are rather empty-headed, have no memory, have just follow along whatever the media tells them, and that's all the information they get. These people, one day they had never heard of Juneteenth. They had been like, what is that? Why do we have a whole holiday? And the complete next day, like, Juneteenth is the most important holiday in our calendar. It's way more important than July 4th, simply because those in power them tell them to. And we have this notion in American society where we're all free-thinking individuals who come to our ideas on our own, and we could never be duped like Oceania citizens in 1984. Well, we could never be like that, but news check, yes, you are. You can be just like that in Oceania. Even though citing 1984 is a little cliche, here it is true, especially with the totally different coverage of the lab leak hypothesis, from like an entire year of condemning it as conspiracy theory, putting yourself at risk of suspension from social media if you even dare mention it, to now government officials saying we're looking into this, Jon Stewart saying it on national TV and being celebrated as a quote-unquote hero for daring to mention this theory, and people just follow along with that. They don't have any type of memory of this. And so and the media doesn't have to worry about any culpability and saying that this is fake and like making sure that people believe it, because they set the tone. They're not going to punish themselves. They're already saying like, oh, why do people believe this? And they all say, they can all now imagine that there was like a separate media in 2020, and it's been replaced by an entirely different media that's now open to this idea in 2021. So it does show how the rapid type of propaganda can work in our country, in our society. And I find that, in some ways it's a little disheartening, and in other ways it's, it's just, not objectively, it's looking at the surface. It's not neither a good or bad thing. It's just a fact of life, and we do need to accept it. It does really skewer this notion that Americans have of themselves, as they're just like these free-thinking individuals who study the topics and this is how they come to conclusions. No, they're just psyoped by media propaganda. With the two examples that we've already talked about with Juneteenth, even with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, and now with the lab leak theory. And Jon Stewart serves his role in being their little guru and their speaker, and he is the NPC speaker. Is that whatever he says, NPCs are likely to believe it, and he's wherever they're at. Jon Stewart and NPCs are never in a different direction. And that's what's going on here. So if you're somebody sharing this positively and lionizing it as something cool, you better rethink that position and remember what this idea is really supporting. And it's not supporting any based in red pill interests. It's actually supporting the globalist American empire. I want to make one final point that dovetails off the last segment we had on the lab leak theory. And this is the last thing I want to talk about before we get to the cognitive elite questions, is that there's this especially among the right wing, there is this idea that we always need to stand up for our nation when it happens, when there's like threatened. Is that people get always mad, which that's a natural, healthy feeling. I don't necessarily want to dispute that. It's like, when you may have problems within your community, but you're always going to defend your community or your family. You're going to have problems always within your family, but when your family's threatened, you're going to side with your family. That's a normal, healthy emotion to have, or sentiment to have with other people. But conservatives necessarily really do abuse this. And this idea comes really to the fore whenever Russia is like promoting something good or saying something base, as that they were saying, both their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and now Putin, are demanding answers about January 6th protests, the cruel treatment that's being dealt to these protesters who had simple political demands, and like, oh, well, you complain about our human rights abuses, but what about this? And these are fair points. And it's like, I don't care that they're Russians saying this, but all these conservatives are like, Putin is trying to trick you. He's trying to trick you. Don't fall for it. Do not fall for it. This is evil. Don't do it. It's like, we're standing up for America. When you Russian assholes try to insult our nation, we're going to stand up for America. It's like, that is so cringe and like peasant tier that you should not engage in that at all. If like somebody says if like a foreign nation says something objectively true about America, that's something that pointing out the anti-white racism of Black Lives Matter, or pointing out our own human rights abuses, are the chaos caused by the riots, you should not say, oh, he's trying to divide us. Don't divide us. We share more with ourselves than we do with any other nation. And this also goes along with this idea that Christopher Rufo, I'm worried that I complain about him too much on this show, because I always have to issue this caveat. We love his work. His work is very important. He just has some really aggravating takes. And I think that a lot of what he's promoting, is a misdirection and not the correct direction that the right should go in. I have two brief points about it. First off, I just want to say is that he admitted in a New Yorker profile that he really liked of himself. He's saying that he didn't vote for Trump in 2016, and people are like, this is surprising. Actually, pretty much everyone in Populist Inc. did not vote for Trump. Josh Hammer, Sohrab Ahmari, I think Adrian Vermeil didn't. I don't think Yoram Hazony didn't. Some of the smaller people that, I don't want to necessarily name, they didn't vote for Trump. Sagar and Jetty didn't vote for Trump. So there's so many people involved in that who didn't vote for Trump. This is like a defining trait. It's like actually voting for Trump. That I don't think they would let you. Actually voting for Trump in 2016, I don't think they'd let you in to Populist Inc. Even though I do know a few people who did. But the more common stance is to not have voted for him. So I just wanted to say that. But going back to the main point that I was discussing is that he had another tweet saying that you have, as Americans, we have a shared common culture. You have more in common with a Black American than you do with a Finnish fisherman. And we shouldn't have racial essentialism. We should have national essentialism. And this is like a cringe version of nationalism. I would say this is like white Americans have more in common with each other than they would with a white Swede or a white Briton on average. Thinking, even though white Briton may have a lot in common, more in common, that might not be the best option. But like a white Frenchman or a white Spaniard, I would probably agree with that point. But you probably would even have saying it's like you have more in common with a Black American than you would with a Swede or a Finnish fisherman. And I even pointed this out. It's like this is kind of a little cheeky, but I was saying that like the Finnish fisherman is more likely to appreciate the greatness of Amorphous' incredible album, The Krillin Isthmus, than a Black American, which is totally true. I don't think blacks don't listen to heavy metal. Well, heavy metal is a very popular music genre in Finland. Thus, I'm more likely to have more in common with the Finnish fisherman because that's something. And then you may be like, well, that's a material culture. That's popular culture. You shouldn't say that. But it does like appreciate similar values and traits and like culture. You're going to have more with like a Finn or a Swede. And there's such an international, there's so great internationalism now that there's not as many differences as you would think between people across the globe. Now, there's something problematic with that, and that's not necessarily saying a globalism matter, but if you approach somebody in the grocery store and you see that guy is white, you don't know what language he speaks, you don't know necessarily where he's from, you just see it's a nice looking white guy, well dressed, and you're gonna be like, I have more in common with that person than the black guy who's like at the counter. That's always what you're gonna see. You're gonna see that person is similar to you. That person may not know one word of English, but you're ultimately gonna see that person as someone more like you than the black person, and that's just how life works. And you want to people want to see people that look like them, that are act like them, that share similar culture and values to them. And even with black Americans and white Americans, there is a pretty big gulf between us. You may say, I don't necessarily agree with that point that there's more in common with, there's more in common with white Americans have more in common with black Americans than they would with a Swede. That's not necessarily the case. And I think it also doesn't understand like how people who live by each other and like have to deal with each other are more likely to have conflicts with each other despite their similarities. Croats and Serbs speak the same language. They have more in common with each other than they would with Swedes. Yet they absolutely hate each other. It's like that they haven't appealed to this view because you are ultimately, yes, you're gonna have more in common with, you're gonna have certain traits that are more in common with somebody who's living next door to you, but that doesn't mean that you're not gonna have fundamental differences that are gonna prevent you from being united into one people or seeing yourselves as one people with no differences in between you. Just look at the Balkans. You don't have to worry necessarily about what the Finn is because you're not living next to a bunch of Finnish fishermen. You're living next to the black community is like 15 minutes away from you. That's like something that's more pressing to you, and that's something that you go there and you see, I'm not a part of this. This is something fundamentally different from myself and from my family. And those differences are going to matter much more than the supposed differences between you and Finnish fishermen. And also, black and white Americans are not uniting together against Finnish fishermen. They're not our problem. They're not our enemy. The one problem is that they're going to do that with is they're going to try to unite us around either anti-Chinese sentiment, not Chinese the people, of course, but the anti-CCP, the Communist Party. I mean, the Chinese people are so good, and we love the Chinese people, but we just hate the Communist Party. They'll do that, or Russophobia, and they'll try to unite us. Like, there's more in common between us than there is between you and a Russian, or you and the Chinese government, Chinese communist official. Oh, there's a lot in common between you and a Chinese citizen, though. They always want to say that the Chinese people are naturally good. They just have a evil, tyrannical government that's entirely different from them. But we don't have the same stance toward the Russians. That's to avoid the racism, obviously. So they want to use that type of uniting rhetoric, but it's a sham, and you shouldn't fall for it. There are fundamental differences between black and white Americans that prevent that kind of unitary effort, and there's always going to be differences, and you can't and Rufo and others have to ask is like, what is the common national culture that they're building around that both black and white Americans share? And they never answer that question, and they usually resort back. And I said this previously about the 1776 Commission. They resort back to the platitudes, the discredited platitudes of the past. It's like we're just about liberty and freedom. We both share that. It's like, no, that's not a uniting principle. So you shouldn't fall for that. And I think and I want to use that example. If you're walking around city, not hearing the language, not hearing C, but you see like a normal looking like German couple or Swedish couple, and then you see like the local black youths, you're gonna see, oh, I have more in common with that German couple than with the black youths, and even though the German couple may not know any English, but that's just how life works, and that's how people should reiterate it, and you shouldn't accept this idiotic unifying concept that just because we have more in common with the Suomi, we should unite. So it's like, well, we're more we have more in common than Finnish fishermen. Oh, okay, that's not a uniting principle. So don't fall for that, but more and more people are going to use that, and it does serve the globalist American empire's interests. and they are specifically trying to use that in not necessarily against Finnish fishermen, but against the Russians and the Chinese. So that's something to look out for. And I don't know, Rufo just continues to post cringe. I try not to hate on him too much or criticize him too much because he does do good work, but he is trying to make himself into a public intellectual, and he is moving from the stance of being an investigative reporter who's exposing this information to being somebody who's articulating an alternative, and the alternative he's suggesting is not really any better than the standard he's attacking. But now on to the cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests or topics for Highly Respected if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack. The two questions today come from Jack. They're actually both music related. I love the music related questions because I love sharing my take on music, even though some of the listeners don't like my music taste. But these are two questions. His first question is thoughts on 2010's Djent and deathcore. Some of my listeners are like, what the hell is Djent and deathcore? Djent is like harder to describe because it's like a very technical way of like playing the riffs. I remember in like there's some bands that are called Djent that like others people. I think like Gojira is best example of Djent. I didn't like Djent. I think it's just like straight like stupid noise. I think Meshuggah would have been the originator of Djent, and they've had albums all the way stretching back to the 90s. But it's the way that they play the riff. It's like too much obsessed with being like creating noise and like being not like really expressing the melody and the power of laden in with metal. It's just like, it's just like playing this like, and I don't like the riffing style. It's just too it's also made, it's trying to be technical and like progressive, but at the same time it's like music made for the enjoyment of people with low IQ because it's not the song structures aren't very well developed. There's just a sound. It's not an appealing sound. It doesn't express the full emotional range and power of metal. And it's just like, you're running your laundry machine in too many in ways that it is like that. I just find it kind of, dumb. I would say that in a very true sense of way. It's like, it just feels like a dumb music, even though these bands are trying to do something technical and progressive with it. On deathcore was really popular when I was in high school. That was becoming, especially, Whitechapel was getting really big. And this is like 2008, 2009. That was like if you were a scene kid, that was the music you listened to. I wasn't a scene kid myself, but I was friends with a bunch of scene kids. And if I went to like the local shows, there'd be like tons of metal deathcore bands. I remember I would listen to like the albums itself, and I'm like, oh, I can see some of these riffs are pretty good, and like there. And then I'd go to the shows, and I'm like, this sucks, because it would not any focus on the music. They'd have like, for some reason, two vocalists, and it was all just like building up to breakdowns. Like there was no focus on riffs. It was just like, here's another breakdown. Like, it's like, okay, there's another breakdown. Here's another, and you're jumping up and down, and this is not like death metal where there's like a full focus on the riffs and developing a well thought out song structure. This is just, something for you to jump up and down and do stupid hardcore dancing. And every time I went to, because some people would like show me Whitechapel stuff, and I'm like, oh yeah, I like some of the riffs, it's pretty good. And then I go to a show, and it's like, this is terrible. Like that would really fully capture the music, because it's all just like noise up until you get to the breakdown. Everything is just built on the breakdown. And I didn't really like that. Not like necessarily if there's some, metal songs, especially in the death metal genre, that uses what would be constituted as a breakdown, but it's used tastefully. It's not used all the time. And there's there's the rest of the song there. It's not just this one leading up to that. So you can hop up and down and do stupid hardcore dancing. So no, I don't like either of the genres. I was surprised deathcore is still very popular. I was talking with somebody who's like does touring a few years ago, and they're telling me about some deathcore band. I had never even heard of. And these guys were making, set aside with contracts, they were all making, like, there's 5 or 6 guys in the band. They're all making 200K a year. I was like, gee, I was like, man, that's a lot of money for like a deathcore band. That's like, that's more than most corporate law associates. And you're doing this and you're like playing music for like teenagers. So it's still popular out there. And I mean, if I go out and see like, normal America, I'll see like kids in like shirts that I can clearly see are like newer deathcore bands and stuff. But that's kind of interesting that some like a music that was big. I think it got really, Job for a Cowboy, I think was the first band to really make it big. Even though they, of course, they didn't invent deathcore, but I think they really made it popular, and I think that was around 2005. So this is like a genre that's been, had a real high degree of popularity among kids for 16 years, and it crosses generations. I mean, that was like in 2005, that would have been like the peak of millennialdom in high school, and now it's it's like Zoomers. Like even some of you could even theoretically argue that like a kid who listened to deathcore as like his rebellious music as a 17-year-old. Maybe he had a kid really young, and now like his like kid at like 13 or 14 is listening to deathcore as well as his rebellious music. So that's something interesting, and that was something very different with the metal that I listen. I listened mostly like 80s and 90s metal, and I definitely thought that I was like a music from a different generation. But they're listening to the same bands that was like from my generation, and that's like 16 years later. That would have been similar to me. That was similar to me. In 2000, the mid to late 2000s, listening to early 90s and 80s music. So that's just something interesting to think of. But I'm sure there's newer bands. I haven't necessarily paid as much attention to it. But in terms of like listenability, I think I'll listen to like the novelty value of deathcore. It's like, oh, reminded me of like going to scene shows in like high school and stuff, and like compared to Degen. Like Degen is like, no, I'm not listening to that. It's like I'll just turn my laundry machine on. So I would rate deathcore higher than Degen. But he has a second question. This is pretty good. He asks, why is the metalcore scene filled with worse people? Every show I go to is filled with people who are fat, have awful tattoos and piercings, or all of the above. There is always a fat chick who passes out in the pit and needs to get dragged out. Not to mention they are also the most obnoxiously left out of other genres. One show I was at pre-COVID, the drummer for the Acacia Strain was wearing a shirt that said pro fucking choice. All these experiences are, and like he says, I don't want to necessarily dox him, but he's like saying that this is like in a southern area where you expect we're more conservative. Yeah, I actually agree with it, but it's like the same with like metal and like every music genre, is that people get into this because they, it is like in a way that they're outcasts. And I don't necessarily think this is peculiar to metalcore, but I think the culture around metalcore is particularly bad, and especially compared to other metal genres, because it's terrible music. That's the ultimate thing, and it is like a totally corporate-driven like marketing product that they came up with. I mean, metalcore, which is like which is different from deathcore. It's probably more commercially appealable. I mean, there was like bands who were getting signed to major labels when I was in middle and high school, like Shadows Fall. Kill Switch Engage. I actually do like one Kill Switch Engage album. I wouldn't say it's necessarily good. It's like a guilty pleasure. I do like Alive or Just Breathing, even though it's goofy and cheesy. I still think it's like a pretty decent album. All That Remains, even though Phil, all that the singer for All That Remains is like retweets me. It is conservative, which is pretty cool. Those bands like I can understand like one song, but it's like still it's like cheesy and bad, but. Like, it's especially this new subculture that is built of, like, never growing up and, like, always being, like, a rebel against, like, standard conservative behavior. And, like, we're getting tattoos and piercings to show how different we are. Now, I know plenty of, like, cool people who have, like, tons of tattoos and, like, piercings. And they're, like, it's more about expressing, like, a certain type of masculinity of, like, it's their way of like displaying like a traditional type of machismo. It's like, you are out, you're trying to show that you are like a real like man. I don't necessarily want to say it's like, but most of the people I know with like lots of tattoos, they can pull it off. Like they're like, it adds an intimidating aura around them, which is men have done since the beginning of time. I mean, that was the original point of tattoos and like war paint, is to show that you're an intimidating figure that you should run away from. I mean, men have been doing this since the dawn of time, and that's like what some of these tattoos and piercings with it. With women, I think it's like a more negative attribute because it's their way of just showing how different they are. It's like, I'm different. I've got a septum piercing, or I've got a throat tattoo, and I was like, oh, I really don't like the fact with like women with tattoos. But with metalcore is like, I don't necessarily think that that's necessarily distinct to metalcore. I think there is, we do overlook some of the more degenerate aspects of the white working class, especially on our side, because we imagine there's many good aspects of the white working class, and this is not a condemnation of it, but the white working class does suffer from many of the degeneracy and the like a lot of the decay and the disabilities we see in our society. There's massive amounts of drug abuse, and a lot of the white working class is very Wiggerish too. Is that people imagine, a lot of in the right imagine the white working class as being these like noble, like upstanding individuals, and a lot of them are like that. This is not a condemnation of the white working class, but these are like the traits, these are like the negative traits that are being associated with the white working class now, and it's not necessarily some of their fault. I mean, there's like a lot of economic downturn, and rap is now the standard male music, and they now emulate the culture and attitudes of black rappers, a lot of them. And so there's a ton of like problems associated with that, with like drug abuse, you know everything in, not being able to hold a job, and several, and being wiggers. So there is this tight, so it's like across the board for a lot of the young white working classes, that there are these cultural pathologies occurring with them. And metalcore is an expression of that. And metalcore as a genre, it is like a corporate friendly message of just like, be different, be yourself. And in order to be yourself and be different, it's to be fat and have weird piercings, and to pass out in the middle of a mosh pit, and like put like a standard sign of like wear a shirt that's expressing system ideology, but in vulgar terms such as pro fucking choice, or like anti fucking racist. That's not rebellion. That's just repeating the system's ideology in more vulgar and coarser terms. And that's what metalcore culture is. It's system approved counter subculture that just repeats. And even many of their song lyrics, and when they're like, we've got a political song, this is like, Trump sucks, and that's their political message. It's their way of acting out in rebellion that is not in any way a rebellion, because they're just repeating back the system ideology in a coarser and more vulgar way. So that's what I would say it was with it. I mean, there's like bad aspects of black metal, very negative aspects of it, and you'll even see interviews, and there's some of these guys have, you can clearly tell that they got some problems with it, but I think they're able to create much better music. And there becomes like some positive, life-affirming aspects of black metal. And black metal is definitely not reaffirming system ideology. The true black metal of it, and even something like death metal, it's not involved in politics. It's just talking about horror and violence. It's not, which even for that is not necessarily allowed in an empowering way, that in a very masculine way, which even that's like threatening to the system. But with metalcore, it's them writing like stupid lyrics about like pro-choice and like how Trump sucks and like Lamb of God or something, and this becomes the rebellion. And yeah, it's just they share the same ideology as the CIA. The woke CIA and metalcore, they're on the same team. So that's what I would say. I mean, so the points I would to conclude is like some of those degenerate aspects you see, that is unfortunately an aspect of the decrepit white working class, which is not necessarily their fault. I mean, they're getting pumped up with these opioids, and these pharmaceutical companies have flooded their communities with drugs, and they've flooded them, and they've taken away a lot of their jobs and a lot of their hope, and that has led to less than healthy culture to develop. So a lot of those aspects you see in metalcore is you'll find it in other working class white cultures. And it's also the fact that metalcore in of itself is just the system ideology repeated back in more vulgar fashion. So with that, I guess that's it for all of Highly Respected today. We'll have a IQ supplement later this week. I said last time it'd be Wednesday. I think it'll be either Wednesday or Thursday. So if you don't see it by Wednesday, just know it'll be up on Thursday. So up until next time, stay respected.